in front of the Washington Convention Center. We shut down the front entrance. Last night we had a great discussion with 4 amazing activists. And tonight we have yet again 3 amazing people here to speak to you. We have Alice Bach, who's going to be moderating and is a retired Stanford professor in biblical studies and regularly contributes to Electric Intifada. We have Miko Peled, who is a known Palestine solidarity activist, as well as Phil Giraldi, who is a great whistleblower, former CIA. I should know this, but Alice Bach is going to introduce you. But I wanted to give her a rundown of the actions today. This morning, we got out at around 11:30 a.m. We did civil disobedience, blocked the entrance to the AIPAC conference center, or to the AIPAC conference. And there were over 100 people that wore Netanyahu masks with bloody hands. So it was an amazing action. We've got another action tomorrow at 6 p.m. in front of the AIPAC Gala, which will also be happening at the Washington Convention Center. So I really hope you all come out to that. Then again on Tuesday, we have another protest at 8 a.m. that Answer Coalition is sponsoring. And then again, we have a protest that Jewish Voice for Peace is sponsoring at 4 p.m. and both of those are at the Capitol. So we hope you all can make it. And here is Alice Bach. So.
If you can't hear me, let me know. Welcome. I am thrilled to be here. I am on the platform with a couple of really activist men, Miko Peled and Phil Giraldi, both of whom are good at making trouble, but making trouble in a prose-like way. You haven't been busted, have you?
In Palestine, I have several times.
Oh. I take it back. Mr. Peled has been busted in Palestine. So he's both. Now, how we have arranged this is that first you will hear from Mr. Giraldi, and then we'll have any questions that you have about what he has talked about. And then we will hear from Mr. Peled, and you will be able to ask questions about what he talked about. And then what we'd really like to do is have a discussion. In some ways similar to the one we had last night for people who were here last night, in which we talk about, where are we going? How are we, what kinds of things can we really do vis-a-vis shutting down AIPAC and moving toward moving Israel out of American government. That will end the evening, and then we can be all excited and ready to go out and cause trouble tomorrow. So first, let me introduce to you an extraordinary gentleman, Mr. Phil Giraldi. He's a former CIA case officer and Army intelligence officer. Spent 20 years messing around in Europe and the Middle East, working terrorism cases. Now, one thing I find very interesting in his vita is that he has a doctorate in modern European history from the University of London. Now, that in itself isn't that interesting, but what is interesting is that his dissertation was on 16th century Venice, Venetian government. Now, what's interesting about that is that it was run by a bunch of oligarchs. And now, of course, he's an expert on the American empire, which is run by a bunch of oligarchs, rich guys. So he didn't know, I'm sure, when he was studying Venice, that years later, he could find parallels that nobody else could. Yeah, I think that's pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, both of these men have a lot more in common than you might think. They are both ardent peacemakers for slightly different reasons, maybe. Miko Peled is interested, by the way, if I say something wrong, just bark. Miko is passionately for a one-state solution between Israel and Palestine, isn't that true? And what Phil's concern about Israel is that it is destroying American values. It's not good for Americans. Now, obviously, it's not good for Americans in a basic, blatant way. There's no money for our people. But I'm sure he will also mention some of the other ways it's not good for Americans in his talk. So both of these gentlemen, although they both come from the military arms wings of their nation's governments. Phil at the CIA and Miko at the IDF, or with the IDF, or whatever. So basically, what we're talking about is two men who lived close to the heartbeat of their nation's protective, serious national security. And they've both withdrawn from that and turned around completely because maybe they got too close. Maybe they saw things that they didn't like to see. I don't know. Maybe they'll tell us, maybe they won't. But what's important, as far as I'm concerned, is that they did both become peacemakers, and they can both teach us what's at stake in the United States continuing to be the tail on the Israeli dog. So if you would like to begin, there's your mic.
Do we know if this is live?
I think it's live.
No.
Okay, push your button up.
Where?
Oh, thank you. All right, everyone can hear me, I guess? Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for that introduction. I'll try to live up to it. Studying 16th century Venice was a real chore, I'll tell you that. I hated every minute of it. Tonight, I would like to thank you for having me here to speak to you. I would like to concentrate on two issues. First is the nature of the special relationship between Israel and the United States, and second is the role of the Israel lobby, and most particularly AIPAC, in shaping that relationship. I was a foreign policy advisor for Ron Paul in 2008, and I still consider myself politically conservative. I respect the fact that nations, including Israel and the United States, must be responsive to their own interests. But because of my personal experience of living and working overseas for more than 20 years, I have come to recognize that the United States is an anomaly in that it persists in going around the world doing things that just don't make any sense. This has been particularly true during the past 14 years since 9/11, with invasions, interventions, and targeted assassinations having become the preferred form of international discourse for Washington. Many of you would almost certainly agree with what I have just observed, but few recognize the role of the special relationship with Israel in shaping what the United States has become. Quite frankly, the relationship is both lopsided in terms of favoring perceived Israeli interests, as well as being terrible for the long-suffering Palestinians, very bad for the United States as it damages the American brand worldwide, and even bad for Israel as it enables its government to act in ways that are ill-advised and ultimately self-defeating. I would first like to address the often repeated mantra that Israel is America's best friend or closest ally, as it is a bedrock issue that is frequently trotted out to excuse behavior that would otherwise be incomprehensible. Apart from being a recipient of more than $3 billion per year from the U.S. taxpayer, Israel is no ally and never has been. There is no alliance of any kind with Israel, in part because Israel has a border that has been moving eastward for the past 50 years as it continues to confiscate Palestinian land. Without an internationally accepted border, it is impossible to define a relationship between two nations. Israel also has no strategic value to the United States, so to speak of an alliance which posits reciprocity is ridiculous. But that is not to say that Israel does not interact with Washington. Indeed, some might say that it possesses a disproportionate voice relating to some foreign and domestic policies. The penchant to use force as a first option in international interaction is perhaps itself due to Washington imitating Tel Aviv or vice versa, as neither the United States nor Israel seems any longer interested in diplomacy. American protection of Israel in international bodies like the United Nations is a disgrace, making the United States de facto complicit in Israeli violations of international law, to include its settlement expansion as well as its war crimes. Under Bill Clinton, the United States more or less adopted the Israeli model in dealing with terrorism, which consists of overwhelming force and no negotiations ever. Washington's uncritical support for Israel politically and militarily was a major factor in motivating the perpetrators of the 9/11 terrorist attack. Deferring to Israel often results in U.S. policies that are absurd and highly damaging to other interests. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice described Israel's devastation of Lebanon in 2006, in which nearly 1,000 civilians were killed and more than $2 billion in infrastructure was destroyed, as the birth pangs of a new Middle East. Yeah, lovely woman. Rice, who also spoke of fear of a nuclear mushroom cloud rising above Washington to justify invading Iraq, far from being discredited due to her lack of discernment, is currently a professor at Stanford University and is now being spoken of as a possible senator from California, or alternatively, as the next commissioner of the National Football League. Which would suggest the value of accountability in Washington. One might well conclude that Israel is not only not an ally, but also not much of a friend. It has run massive spying operations inside the United States to include hundreds of art students and celebrations by the employees of an Israeli moving company located in New Jersey when the Twin Towers were going down. Israel is regularly named by the FBI as the most active friendly country in terms of running espionage operations against the U.S., but nothing ever happens. Israeli spies are sent home quietly, and Americans who spy for Israel are rarely prosecuted. Last year, we witnessed Hollywood producer and Israeli citizen Arnon Milchan receiving an Oscar, even as stories were circulating about his criminal collusion to obtain restricted American technology to enable Israel to build a nuclear weapon. The Justice Department has not seen fit to do anything about him. Israel also has a hand in what is going on domestically in the United States. Many states now have their own departments of Homeland Security, and many of the companies that obtain contracts to provide security services are Israeli. Airport security is a virtual Israeli monopoly throughout the world. Increasingly militarized American police officers now use federal grants to travel to Israel for training based on the Israeli experience with the Palestinians. Israelis have advised CIA and Pentagon torturers, and Israeli advisors were also present at Abu Ghraib. Israel's influence over Washington policies frequently means war. American officials extremely close to the Israeli government were behind the rush to war with Iraq. If Washington goes to war with Iran in the near future, it will not be because Tehran actually threatens America. It will be because Israel and its powerful lobby in the U.S. have succeeded in creating an essentially false case to mandate such action. Congress is obligingly advancing legislation that would commit the United States to intervene militarily in support of a unilateral Israeli attack, meaning that Israel could easily be empowered to make the decision on whether or not the U.S. goes to war. Israel interferes in American elections in 2012 on behalf of Mitt Romney, and also this week by aligning itself with the Republicans against the President of the United States to harden existing policy against Iran. Looking ahead to elections in 2016, two billionaires have already stated clearly that they will spend whatever they have to elect the candidate that is best for Israel. As Sheldon Adelson is a Republican and Haim Saban is a Democrat, both major parties are covered. And I would warn, watch out for Hillary, Saban's candidate of choice. Israel has corrupted our Congress, which we will witness again on Tuesday when Netanyahu speaks. Benjamin Netanyahu publicly rebukes and belittles our own head of state. Its government ministers insult and ridicule John Kerry, and its intelligence officers have free access to Capitol Hill, where they provide alarmist and inaccurate private briefings for American legislators. In short, Israel has no reluctance to use its enormous political and media clout in the U.S. to pressure successive administrations to conform to its own foreign and security policy views. Beyond the corruption of our political process, I believe many in this room would agree that the depiction and treatment of the Palestinians has been disgraceful. Israel has engaged in land and water theft and is doing its best to make Palestinian life so miserable that they will all decide to leave. Some would describe this as ethnic cleansing. Just last week, there were reports of how Israeli authorities cut off water and electricity to parts of the West Bank, and also won a bogus court case in New York City that will bankrupt the Palestinian Authority. Netanyahu's policy is to punish the Palestinians incessantly, no matter what they do. The United States has certainly embraced a lot of unpleasant policies over the past 14 years, but I honestly think that most Americans would be appalled if they knew how Palestinians really have been treated. Unfortunately, the Israeli propaganda machine has been able to maintain a tight grip on the narrative promoted in the mainstream media. Arabs are depicted as terrorists, while Israelis are seen as folks just like us. How does all this happen? Because of money, which enables the Israeli firsters to control the media and buy the politicians. But unfortunately, no one is allowed to say that, lest Abe Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League accuse one of propagating a stereotype that is an anti-Semitic myth. American media corporations and national politics are in fact totally corrupted by money and the control that it buys, and that's not just relating to Israel, that's relating to everything. One would have to be blind not to recognize the fact. This is where the groups like American Israel Public Affairs Committee, better known as AIPAC, come in. AIPAC is only one part of the octopus, characteristically operates in the shadows. It prepares position papers that are then distributed in Congress, and many congressmen, largely ignorant of the issues. I would just comment as an aside, congressmen generally are ignorant of all issues. The congressmen then proceed to parrot what AIPAC gives them. AIPAC operative Steve Rosen once boasted that he could have signatures of 70 senators on a napkin within 24 hours. Congressmen also know that crossing the Israel lobby is career damaging. Senators William Fulbright and Chuck Percy were among the first to feel its wrath when they were confronted by well-funded challengers backed by effective media campaigns who defeated them in spite of their outstanding records as legislators. The founder of my own organization, Council for the National Interest, Congressman Paul Finley, also suffered the same fate when he fell afoul of the lobby. Within the government, the purge has also been widespread in the bureaucracy, with the traditional Arabists at State Department forced out to be replaced by Friends of Israel, many of whom are political appointees rather than career diplomats. There is no simple solution to what I've been telling you. Certainly a more honest media would produce American voters who are better informed, but even though AIPAC has long been defending the indefensible, the corruption in Congress runs deep, and it is difficult to find a constituency anywhere in the United States where it is possible to vote for a candidate who is not openly and enthusiastically supportive of the Israeli relationship. In Virginia last year, where I live, there were several important congressional races. All the candidates were vetted for their views, checked out on their views on Israel well before the nomination and voting process started. But to return to AIPAC, there should be demands from all of us that it and other similar Israel advocacy organizations register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938. That would require them to have complete transparency in terms of where their money comes from, and would also tell the American people that the organizations themselves are not necessarily benign and acting on behalf of U.S. interests, which is the subterfuge that they currently employ. It is certainly past time to push back against an organization or organizations that are brazenly promoting the interests of a foreign government at the expense of the American people. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Ever since 1967, the military occupation has remained in place in West Bank and Gaza. And what we've adopted since 9/11, calling it counter-terrorist principles, are really just those tactics and principles that are used in any military government, military oppression system, whether you call it martial law or military government. And I think we're seeing that, obviously we're seeing it spill over since 9/11 into the domestic law of the United States. I represent Guantanamo detainees, and we're expanding that, using those same principles to apply worldwide. So I guess, Mr. Giraldi, would you want to comment on perhaps the spillover we're seeing from the occupied territories into our own system, but calling it counter-terrorist law?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I don't think anybody has ever really seriously studied the influence of Israeli policies on U.S. doctrines and how these things evolve and how they kind of come together. We certainly have seen, I mean, Israel is essentially a militarized society. You can argue the reasons for that or how that came about, but essentially that's what it is. And the United States is definitely moving in that direction. And 9/11, of course, is the excuse. But there are a lot of interests, in addition to Israeli parochial interests, the military-industrial complex. You have various bureaucracies, including the one I used to work for, that benefit from higher levels of spending and benefit from having greater access to money and power. So there are a lot of things that come together, but we're seeing a definite transition in the United States to, I think you would agree with me, to where we're on the cusp of becoming a kind of national security state, in which national security becomes the imperative, and the imperative drives everything else. And this is something that people should try to come to grips with, because it's not just a question of NSA spying, it's not just a question of what Israel is doing this week, it's a question the whole thing is coming together. And it's creating a matrix that is extremely dangerous, and that once it goes far enough, it's irreversible.
My question is, do you think that we're in a different moment right now with what Netanyahu's doing and I think the mistakes are of the Israeli government? And do you think that the lobby has been weakened? Do you think, I mean, there are people in the movement that say, well, the Israeli lobby is gone and it's no longer going to be such a big force. I think they're underestimating the lobby. But my point is, I'd like to have an analysis of what you think the lobby is going to do, how much strength they have. For the first time, we have 37 Congress people boycotting a speech, which we wouldn't have had that last year. So I think the question then is, how qualitatively different is this moment?
Thank you. That's a crucial question. A year ago, I spoke to the media in an interview about this very subject when AIPAC had its last meeting. And I said that, in my opinion, AIPAC is dead. And I believe AIPAC and the rest of the Israel lobby is basically dead. And I believe that because the task of defending what Israel does is beyond all credibility now. There's just no way that this thing can be sustained forever. But, on the other hand, as you point out, the lobby remains extremely powerful. Walk down the street to the convention center if you want to see how powerful it is. And we'll see, two people from the White House making apologetic speeches, that'll be, I guess, tomorrow. And so anyway, the lobby is still extremely powerful. It owns Congress. It owns much of the media. And it's going to take a long time for it to go away. But I firmly believe that, yeah, we've crossed two corners, or we turned two corners maybe. The first corner was back about a year ago when, with Gaza and everything, it was very clear that Israel was outside the pale. And now I think we turned another corner when the level of Israeli interference in the U.S. government process, which is indeed a denial of our type of government and our process, is becoming clear to everyone.
I beg to differ about the notion that the relations between the U.S. and its proxy state, Israel, are not reciprocal. To quote Secretary of State Haig 30 years ago, he said that Israel is the American aircraft carrier in the Middle East that cannot be sunk and needs no soldiers to protect it. What do you think about that? And clearly the situation is changing, as you mentioned, dramatically recently, but what do you think about the whole concept of Israel allowing for U.S. imperialism in the Middle East? Okay,
this is a Chomsky-esque argument that basically Israel is an element in the U.S. Being a capitalist and imperialist and warmongering society. I think that's simplistic. I was in the government when Haig made that comment. You would expect any senior government official in the United States to say nice things about Israel. I think that the comment about Israel being an unsinkable aircraft carrier, which actually comes from Britain in the Second World War, that's where the expression comes from, they never applied to Israel. We never had a base in Israel. We've never used Israel as a jumping board for any military operations. Israel is of no strategic importance whatsoever. When I was a CIA officer, in the Middle East and in Europe, I used to see the intelligence that Israel used to pass for us. It was a joke. Every Israeli intelligence report that came to the United States was could have been an editorial in the Washington Post. It was essentially pushing an Israeli point of view, lying about what Arabs and Iranians and others were up to try to get Americans convinced that there was some kind of threat coming from that direction. The only threat coming was from Israel. And I say that quite honestly. The bilateral relationship between Israel and the United States has always been garbage. It's always been weighted heavily in favor of Israel. The United States has gotten virtually nothing out of it.
Forgive me if I'm misinterpreting, but it seemed to me that you were saying when you said AIPAC is dead, my own feeling is that's an overstatement. And as long as we have 6 global corporations controlling the media and Congress following for it, and it seems to me that most of the people in the United States are still really, really supportive of Israel and whatever it is they do. I think we're moving towards a tipping point myself, but I don't think we're there yet. And so what I'm really asking you for, and I appreciate the really strong analysis of what you gave, but I think a whole lot of people in the room have read and maybe even written themselves in their own point analyses. And what I think we lack time after time is what we're going to do about it, and how all of the organizations that we represent, how we're finally going to get together and actually make a movement with a list of things that we're going to accomplish and how we're going to go about it and how we're going to raise the money to do it. And where's our 70 million? And where's our 100 million? And we have certainly enough millionaires among the progressives and people who agree with us that we should be able to do it. So this is the job of the leaders, to me, to make this begin to happen instead of each having organizations with 2,000 people and 10,000 people and 50,000 people. This is the job of us to get together and to make a movement that actually overcomes AIPAC and overcomes Congress and elects our officials. And so this is really what I want from you guys.
Yeah, well, I thought I said Israel that the lobby was dead, but it's going to take a long time for it to roll over. You know, but, I think it's dead because when you reach a point where you're defending the indefensible all the time, you're no longer playing the splendid little democracy in the Middle East game. Nobody buys that anymore. Nobody's buying the arguments anymore. So, but the other, your more serious comment about why can't we get together? Well, the reason we can't get together is because we can't. We have no focal point. The Israel lobby focuses on one issue, and everyone in the lobby is very aware of what that issue is. It's like Haim Saban says. He says, I'm a one-issue guy, and that issue is Israel. Everybody in this room has a different political baggage that they come into this debate with. I'm a conservative. I'm a Pat Buchanan type conservative. That's how I got into this, questioning Israel business. I started with Pat Buchanan. Now, many of you are progressives. You probably come from different elements of the rainbow in terms of what it means to be a progressive. So that's our problem. We don't have like a leading figure. We don't have a leading institution. And if we tried to set up something that was called something like the Enemies of Israel condominium or something like that, we would be immediately smeared in the media. We would be, probably the IRS would come after us. You know what I'm saying.
Yeah, but I'm thinking short-sighted.
Okay.
I don't know whether there's a millionaire. No,
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Ayman Nijim. I am from Gaza Strip. I have your question for the CIA officer. Thank you for your speech and speaking power to truth. But I want to ask a question. For us as Palestinians from Gaza, should we stay all of our life in our concentration camp? And what we gonna do? Like, should we stay until Sarah Palin come to office? It is a good question. So what we have 92% of traumatized kids in Gaza. We have 400,000 homeless in Gaza. My wife and 2 kids are homeless in a United Nations shelter. So what we should do? Should we wait until we die? It is, I want your analysis, what we as like based on your experience, emails, correspondence, what do you think is the best option for us, non-violently? We are coming here to know about non-violence. So what's your option? What's your idea? What are we going to do? Thank you.
Well, quite honestly, I don't have an answer for you. I mean, when you recognize that the whole political world order is corrupt, there's not a simple answer based on humanitarianism. There's not a simple answer based on doing what's right, because we don't see that. I personally can write you a check for $100, but it's not going to help very much, is it? No. But I understand. I understand where you're coming from. No, please, let me finish. I understand exactly where you're coming from. We should be able to talk in concrete terms about doing things that actually will make things better, but we're not there yet. The problem is we don't control the levers of power. We don't control the mechanisms that would enable us to do something important, and that's why we're all here. Because I think we have to change the atmosphere in terms of what's going on and how things are perceived and what governments and institutions are doing. But that's all we can do.
I have a question.
Okay.
We all know that Israel has weapons of mass destruction, and we even know where they are. So how come nobody else in the Middle East can have them when everybody knows Israel does, except Israel?
Yeah, well, that's because the media and the political class have shaped the debate in a different way. And this is why I get back to why I argue the way I do about why Israel's a problem. The debate, if you pick up today's Washington Post or yesterday's Washington Post or the New York Times, you'll see the same thing there, which is essentially that it's not a question of Israel's weapons, it's a question of Iran's weapons, that Iran is a threat and Israel is not a threat. Israel's just like us. It's one of the guys.
But we're a terrible threat.
Well, I know, but it's not formulated that way. It's the way the debate is shaped in the media, the way the debate is shaped down the street and the way the debate is shaped over on Capitol Hill. And it's, you got to change that perception, and that's why we're here. We've got to change that perception. We've got to change the understanding of what's going on in the world and why it's going on the way it is. And I don't have any other solutions beyond that. If we can get the Israel lobby to register and people begin to see the Israel lobby as a foreign agent, like, that's a pretty good first step, and I think that's an achievable step. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
I'm a former Air Force cryptolinguist.
okay, this is your last question, okay?
My job was to fly around in the back of an airplane listening to North Vietnamese radio transmissions. Some of my friends who are deceased now flew the same sort of mission in the Mediterranean. They monitored an Israeli attack on a U.S. Navy ship on June 8th. They destroyed the ship, killed over 30 sailors, wounded over 170 more. The Navy sent fighters to help that ship. The White House called them back. This was a false flag attack intended to give the U.S. an excuse to come into the 1967 war and bomb Egypt. The torpedo that hit the ship hit the room containing the communication technicians monitoring the Israelis murdering Egyptian POWs. This attack shows Israel is not a friend of the U.S. It also shows you the control they have over the U.S. government, because it was the president in person who called back those Navy fighters saying, we don't want to embarrass a friend. As a CIA officer, you may have some knowledge of this incident.
Yeah, I know quite a bit about it, and I've spoken to other Liberty survivors. This is possibly the lowest point in Israeli-American relations, and I would put it squarely on Lyndon B. Johnson, but as you say, it's symptomatic of the control, even back in 1967, the Israelis had over the political process in the U.S. When I was driving here tonight with my wife, there have been some stories recently revealing how JFK was threatened by the initial form of the Israel lobby, which he was trying to register, so that he was told that he would not receive any Jewish contributions for his election campaign if he said anything good about the Palestinians. Harry Truman was basically suborned in the same way in 1948 to win election. Yeah, it's disgraceful. And the Liberty is probably, I agree with you absolutely, the Liberty is probably the lowest, most disgusting point in this horrible, lopsided bilateral relationship. Thank you very much for your comments.
Before I introduce Miko Peled, I would like to thank Mary Ellen Bennett, who pulled this whole thing together. Believe it or not, it was not easy, because many people have different ideas about things, and they won't win. It is a great thrill to be able to introduce Miko Peled, who is a peace activist who dares to say in public what many people choose to deny. And we've already been talking about some of the great denials about what Israel does. Well, here's an Israeli. He has credibility, so when he debunks myths that few Jews around the world still hold with blind loyalty, people listen. We are lucky to have with us tonight Miko's publisher, who has copies of The General Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, a book of Miko's, and if you buy a copy, I bet Miko will sign it. If you you want him to. Miko is a strong supporter of BDS. During the assault on Gaza in the summer of 14, Peled wrote, and I quote, "Israel is an illegitimate creation brought about by a union between racism and colonialism. The refugees who make up the majority of the population in the Gaza Strip are a reminder of this. The people of occupied Palestine are a constant reminder of the crime of ethnic cleansing upon which Israel was established." Now, with an introduction like that, it is a great joy to hear from Miko Peled.
Thank you. Thank you for all everybody that put this and these whole events together. I think this is a great initiative. It's extremely important. It's a pleasure to be here once again with Helen, now my publisher. We were here exactly 2 or so years ago when the book came out, 2.5 years ago when the book came out. So it's great to be back again and see so many familiar faces and talk about this issue right as AIPAC is down the street and Netanyahu is somewhere around here too. And it's a great privilege to sit here with Phil and speak after he does. The reason I was making notes, I wasn't texting or anything, but I was writing notes as he was saying, because he was saying all these wonderful things. So it's great to build on that. So it's always good to speak after somebody who's smarter than you are. It's a great advantage. And many important things I think were said here. For example, the need for a focal point. I think there is a focal point. I think the focal point is ending the Zionist occupation in Palestine, just like people were fighting to end apartheid in South Africa, and replace it with a democratic regime over all of Palestine. Just like in South Africa, the name of the game was ending apartheid in order to have a democratic regime, one person, one vote in South Africa. This has to be the focal point. This is the focal point as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's important for us to internalize this and then to talk about this and make sure that this is what we're talking about. Now, it's funny, on the way here on the plane, Daryl Issa was sitting next to me for a few minutes. And it was funny because he was, first of all, he was sitting in coach. Number two, he had the middle seat. And I thought, that's kind of, kind of cool. A congressman not only sitting in coach, but in the middle seat. And so I always carry a couple of books in my bag. So for, who knows who might be sitting next to me. So I gave him a book right away, signed it. And just as we were beginning to talk, the flight attendant found a better seat for him, an aisle seat somewhere. So he moved. And I just asked him if he will be attending the speech. And he said yes, and followed up with some explanation as he moved away. What I didn't get to say to him was, I think that if he does attend the speech, in fact, I know for a fact, for certain I should say, that if he does attend the speech, he will live to regret it. He will live to see the day where people who went to hear Netanyahu speak will be shamed and will either deny it or come up with some kind of an excuse why they went to hear the speech. The willingness to listen to Netanyahu speak, to this cold-blooded murder of innocent civilians speak, to clap, to shake his hand, is something which, like I say, and I'll say this again, there's no doubt in my mind that we will all see the day when the people who were in that chamber will somehow either hide in some corner or deny it or find some kind of an excuse why they had to do it, And this really brings us to this whole issue of AIPAC. It is an organization that is supporting and has been supporting a brutal, racist, violent regime. And this is the name of the game. This is the focal point. What is AIPAC here to do? AIPAC is here to support a brutal occupation of Palestine, a brutal regime that has been keeping Palestinians under horrifying conditions for almost 7 decades. This mythical notion that the occupation of Palestine began in 1967 is mythical and should be tossed away. The occupation of Palestine has been going on since 1948. Palestinians, whether they live in Palestine or whether they're in refugee camps, have been living in horrifying conditions. Whether they are under Israeli rule, which is military rule, whether Israeli rule that is civil rule, whether they're in refugee camps, whatever the case may be, they are living in horrifying conditions as a result of this brutal, murderous, racist regime that exists in Palestine. AIPAC is there to protect it. Now, I think it's important to appreciate what AIPAC does and how AIPAC began. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, and again, I talk about much of this in the book, and I came to realize a lot of how these things began when I was working on my book on the General Son, because a lot of it has to do with my family's history and our connection to Zionism and the State of Israel. My maternal grandfather was part of a group of these very well-educated, very refined, well-dressed Zionists who were, by the way, didn't look Jewish, spoke many European languages, were all doctors and so forth, who were really the predecessors of AIPAC. They would travel around the world and speak about Zionism and try to convince the powers that be why they should support Zionism. I have a poster in my office advertising a speech by my grandfather in 1920. I forget what city. It's in Russian. But the date, it says March 20th, 1920, in some city in Russia, to speak about the situation in Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Over the last 70 or so, no, 70, almost 100 years, I should say, this very, very smart, very effective group of people that were able to develop a great deal of influence. So they've influenced, not only in the United States, by the way, but in the West in general. They've influenced the education system and the culture and politics and the media and so forth. Americans don't need AIPAC in order to know that Israel is, like Phil said, they're like us. Because if you look at seventh grade humanities textbooks, you're going to see the story of Israel as it is related in the Bible. If you take a look at an AP history, high school AP history book, world history book, and I did that with my kids, you will see an entire chapter about the ancient Hebrews, which is all biblical, not a single shred of historical evidence. King David, King this, King that, all of which has never been proved historically, all of which is taken from the Bible, all of which is there to strengthen the Zionist narrative and to teach the Zionist narrative, I should say. It would be as though they may as well have creationism in the AP World History book. Teach creationism as history. So we have to appreciate decades and decades and decades of this sort of influence. I believe it's in the state of Texas, but it might be in other places, where the ADL, which is one of those tentacles of that octopus that Phil was mentioning, which is really a racist organization pretending to be a civil rights organization. That's what the ADL is. They have a course on tolerance that they teach in schools. And a school that has its students go through this tolerance course gets a tolerance certificate. By the way, part of what is taught in that course is how Palestinians are terrorists, and if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. And the reason I know this is because I spoke in Dallas, and some parents who have children, and Palestinians who have children in schools, in public schools, said, what do we do about this? Came and told me about this. So it's very sophisticated. It's been going on for a very long time. But again, we have to remember that the purpose of AIPAC is to lobby for a regime that is brutal and evil and needs to be removed. And again, the focal point has to be the removal of this regime and the transformation of Palestine into a real democracy where Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace. The notion that peace can be achieved with Israel is wrong. And we've seen that. All these attempts over the since 1967, to talk about or to create this, this illusionary, mythical, pie-in-the-sky two-state solution have failed. Even though I think some of the people that were promoting it were well-intentioned. To somehow assume that a state that was established based on racism and colonialism, and that sees all of Palestine as the land of the Jews, would somehow be able to rein that in and say, you know what, you're going to have to stop your racism and colonialism right around this line right here, because this is Palestine. It's an absurd idea. It's science fiction. And when we see, and again, I talk about this in the book, because again, my father was a general right at that point in 1967, during the 1967 war, we see exactly what happened. As soon as the West Bank was taken, Israel did in the West Bank what it did everywhere else, which is destroy cities, towns, and villages, force into exile hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, countless Palestinians, and build for Israeli Jews only, which is exactly what Israel does all the time, all over Palestine. People are still, you'll see a headline, Israel builds settlements in East Jerusalem. Israel, develops more land in the West Bank. Who cares? It develops land in the Negev Desert, and in the Galilee, and in Jaffa, and in Jerusalem, and in the West Bank. There's no difference for them. It's all Israel. Who cares? All this notion that the West Bank is somehow different from the rest of the country, it's all in people's imagination. Israel doesn't see it differently. Never has. The plans to take the West Bank were already in place long before the West Bank was taken. So again, back to the focal point. All of Palestine is occupied. All of Palestine has to be free. Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace together as people, as long as this racist apartheid regime is removed. This notion that 12 million people who live there, 6.1 million of whom are not Jewish, are Palestinians, so the majority is not Jewish, it's Palestinian, can live in peace under a regime that considers the entire country as a Jewish state. It's absurd. And besides, what's Jewish about it? What is Jewish about? Most Jews don't live there. Most of the people who do live there are not Jewish. What, they espouse some wonderful Jewish values? What Jewish values do they espouse? Deny Palestinian water? Palestinians, who make up more than half of the population, receive about 3% of the water. 3% of the water. Palestinians live under laws that are completely different, and in a reality that is completely different from Israelis. Whether they're Israeli citizens or whether in the West Bank and Gaza makes no difference. And as we see on a regular basis, and if anybody's paying attention, attacks on Gaza didn't begin in 2008. Attacks on Gaza began in the early 1950s when Israel created the Gaza Strip in order to house hundreds of thousands of refugees who were forced out of their homes in Palestine, other parts of Palestine. That's why there's a Gaza Strip. If there was no ethnic cleansing, there'd be no refugee camps. If there'd be no refugee camps, there'd be no resistance. There'd be no Hamas. What AIPAC manages to do very, very successfully, and Israel does, the Israeli government does, of course, is to keep everything isolated. Nothing is connected to anything else. Suddenly Hamas is shooting rockets out of Gaza. Suddenly they're shooting rockets out of Gaza. We give them Gaza and suddenly they're shooting rockets out of Gaza. It has nothing to do with anything. Why are there refugees in Gaza? Why do people in Gaza have no access to clean water, basic medicine, nutrition, travel? Why? Oh, we don't want to talk about that, but why? 10-minute drive from Gaza, in Israeli cities, people live like this. 10-minute drive. I'm not talking about, Gaza is some remote, post in God knows where in some hill in Afghanistan where there's no electricity, no water. The water and the electricity stop where the population stops being Jewish and begins being Palestinian. That's where the water and the electricity suddenly stop. As soon as there's an Israeli settlement, a Jewish settlement, boom, water and electricity show up, but only to the Jewish homes. During this last assault on Gaza, this last summer, I was there. This cold-blooded murder of thousands of civilians, for which Netanyahu will one day hopefully be charged, with which he will be charged one day. Life in Israel was uninterrupted. I drove all around the boundary with Gaza, so of course you see all these countless tanks and military. You'd think World War III was going on in there. Now, there's never been a tank in Gaza. There's never been a military force in Gaza. Gaza has never had an army. But 10 minutes away from Gaza, life is like this. Coffee shops are full, restaurants are full, highways are full of cars. Life is fine. 10 minutes away, I'm not even talking Jerusalem, which is, 45-minute drive away. This is the reality, and this is exactly what AIPAC has been very good at doing, is isolating it. This has nothing to do with this, but we know it does. And that's why I say Israel is this illegitimate creation that was born as a result of the racism and colonialism that was brought to Palestine from Europe by the Zionists. Another thing that AIPAC manages to do very well is to somehow make them all our enemies. It's the enemy of the United States. Whether it's Hamas, whether it's Iran, whether it's the Holy Land Foundation, which is a Muslim charity that had to be closed down, and 5 men are spending, the rest of their lives really in federal prison for doing nothing wrong. Whether it's Rasmi Aoudeh, whether it's Sami Arabi, all of these cases, suddenly, this is AIPAC's strongest suit. They're able to connect all of these things and make us all our enemies, and when we take a look at all these things, there's a common denominator. These are all issues that somehow stand in the way of the narrative. The narrative that says, number one, Israel is our ally, they're like us. Number two, this biblical, mythical narrative that says that the Jews finally, after 2,000 years, came back to claim their land and they were attacked by these evil Arabs and evil Muslims and so on and so forth. Iran has never posed a threat, just like Gaza has never posed a threat. The only threat is to the narrative. The only threat is to the legitimacy of this brutal regime that has been occupying Palestine for almost 7 decades. That is the threat, and that is why Palestinians are being killed. And that is why there's a discussion about Iran. And that is why all these Palestinians and Muslims in America have to suffer. Because they pose a threat to a narrative. And this narrative is exactly, this jewel that AIPAC is trying to maintain, and it's fighting a losing battle. And I agree with Phil, I think AIPAC is dying. Because now they're fighting a battle that they're losing. Who are they fighting? They're fighting students on campuses, SJP. They're fighting churches who are going to Palestine in order to see Palestine and help the Palestinians. They're fighting the movement, the BDS movement, which by all standards is legitimate, is principled, is nonviolent, is just, and has a track record. And they're losing on all fronts. They're losing on all fronts, which of course is a very good thing. I agree too, of course, they're not rolling over yet, but I definitely agree that they're dying. I think what's going to bring them down is their arrogance and their stupidity. Because brutal regimes are arrogant and stupid. They do not see the threat. When they look... Thank you. First of all, they don't even see Palestinians. They don't see Palestinians. They have no appreciation for the fact that places in the West Bank like Bil'ain and Abi Saleh and Bet Umar and all these other places where they've had non-violent protests for years now. For a decade, actually. It's 2015 now. They started in 2005. Have become the Mecca for activists. All of these places have become Mecca for activists. They don't even see that. They have no appreciation for the fact that Palestinians inside of Israel, who are Israeli citizens, who used to call themselves by this very racist name that Israel gave them, which are the Arabs of Israel, Arviyei Israel, are all now calling themselves Palestinians. They all wear the Palestinian insignia. They all carry the Palestinian flag during the attacks on Gaza. All the Palestinian towns and villages inside of 1948 were out in the streets, burning tires, protesting, getting arrested, getting beaten, just like their brothers everywhere else. They're completely oblivious to this. They don't see this. They don't see people like us. They have no appreciation for the solidarity movement, though they are trying to fight it. And this arrogance And this stupidity is exactly what was going to be their downfall. And I think that's to our advantage. I've no doubt that this is going to happen. I've no doubt that within the next decade we're going to see the fall of Zionism in Palestine, just like we saw the fall of apartheid in South Africa. The problem is I think many Palestinians are still going to die. I think our friend here from Gaza, is it Ayman? I think your family is probably going to be living homeless for a very long time still before this happens. This siege on Gaza is a cruel and brutal and criminal siege. And it's part of this hysteria and this blind support for Israel regardless of what Israel does. It is brutal, it is unjustifiable, it is inexcusable. Just like the thousands of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. This is all part of the same thing. And sadly, it's not going to end soon enough. Over 2,000 people were murdered in cold blood last summer by Israel, with the US being complicit, as we know, and other European countries being complicit. More are going to die from their injuries because they have no access to hospitals, to proper health care, because Israel won't allow it. Even though 15-minute drive from Gaza, you have perfectly well-equipped medical facilities. And sadly, I believe there will be more attacks on Gaza before this is over. So nothing is happening fast enough. But it is moving in the right direction, and I go back to what I said in the beginning, the focal point must be clear to us. Well, it's certainly clear to me, and I know it's clear to many of you. The focal point is ending the Zionist regime and occupation of Palestine, period. So that we say free Palestine, we're clear that all of Palestine needs to be free. Thank you very much.
Questions?
It seems that Mr. Netanyahu is coming to Washington in order to undermine the negotiated settlement that Mr. Obama is trying to reach with Iran. My question is, what was the role of Israel and of Mr. Netanyahu in particular in pushing the U.S. into war with Iraq?
With Iraq?
Thank you.
Or Iraq?
10 years ago.
Yeah, I can answer that. There are a number of narratives that go around about the Iraq War and how it came about. I would note that if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it is a duck. And what we saw was a Pentagon that was loaded from top to bottom with people that I would call Israel firsters. And I'm talking about Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, and we all know who they are. And these people basically were, as soon as 9/11 happened, focused on Iraq. And they focused on Iraq because there were incentives in terms of going after Iraq. Primarily, if you go back in time, you would recall that Saddam Hussein was giving money to Palestinian families that had their children and husbands and killed by the Israeli army, and this was one of the motives. Another motive that was surfaced by Richard Pearl in particular, they were going to rebuild the pipeline from Basra to Haifa to benefit Israel, make Israel energy independent. So there were motivations even back then in terms of going after Iraq. And the Israeli government got on board. They were enthusiastic about the United States invading Iraq. It's people today, in a revisionist way, say that, well, Israel didn't really want the United States to attack Iraq because it wanted the United States to attack Iran. Well, that may be true. But the fact is, if you go back in time, put yourself in their shoes back then, and remember what was being said, Israel was fully behind this. It was Israel's friends who set this whole thing up, and Israel's friends who, to this day, defend it.
Just do boy, girl, boy.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to say one thing, that I agree with you. But we need to remember what's helped start this whole thing, and that's the pogroms in Russia. The beginnings of immigration to Palestine for people trying to survive. So I don't know. I just can't forget that. It's tragic what has happened, the abuse of the Palestinian people, and the abuse of people around the world. It keeps on happening. And I think the only way we're going to stop it is from our own government to stop funding Israel, period.
Yeah, well, that's easier said than done. Look, the pogroms in Russia, the vast majority of Jews who were victims, whether it's the pogroms in Russia, whether it's Hitler, whether it's all kinds of horrible things that happened to Jews, ended up coming to countries that at least promised tolerance to everyone. Of course, mostly here in America. Very few actually became Zionists and went to occupy somebody else's land, which is what the Zionists did. You know, the vast majority, they talk about this, you talk about the pogroms in Russia, people usually talk about the Holocaust. But somehow people ignore the fact that only a very small fraction of Holocaust survivors went to Palestine. The vast majority either returned to Europe to reclaim their lives or came to America. And this is important for two reasons. Number one, this whole idea that somehow Israel is a response to the Holocaust is not true, because because Holocaust survivors themselves spoke with their feet and did not come to Israel, did not come to the so-called Jewish state. And many of the ones who did come ended up leaving with disgust. And if there is a response to the Holocaust and to pogroms and to intolerance, it is creating more tolerance. It's not creating one more intolerant racist state. On the other side of that coin is, I think it's unfair to say, to make it seem as though Holocaust survivors are complicit with the crimes of Zionism. My family was in Palestine, came to colonize and occupy Palestine long before the Holocaust. It had nothing to do with the Holocaust. Long before the Holocaust. The plan for ethnic cleansing was already in place. It wasn't executed perhaps quite, but it was already in place before the Holocaust. It had nothing to do with the Holocaust. So it's true that some of the people who immigrated into Palestine, some of the Jews, were actual victims of this sort of intolerance and racism, but the vast majority are not. However, Israel, and certainly Israel's lobby here in the US and all of its tentacles, know how to manipulate the suffering of Jews and others around the world and use it to their advantage very cynically. You know, with all these tolerance museums and Holocaust museums everywhere we go. But I think it's very important to point out that Israel is not the refuge for Jewish people. The Jewish people found refuge, and if you talk to many Holocaust survivors who went to Israel and left, they couldn't wait to leave because of how they were treated by the Zionists. The contempt with which Holocaust survivors were treated by the Zionists, even today. So I think there's a separation here that has to be made absolutely clear about those two things.
Thank you both for your comments. I'm in the back of the room. The mic made its way back here. It's interesting because I work in government relations, so I take a very holistic, neutral approach to any issue that I deal with in my day-to-day job. And saying that as a Palestinian American, I'm very curious, what is the sentiment in Israel? Like, how do people who live in Israel, so to speak, look at these people, particularly as they border with the communities? You know, we very much see in the United States like a self-fulfilling bias of people who are Republican watch and read certain outlets, people who are Democratic or more liberal read certain outlets. And so as somebody who has this more neutral view, it's like, I always feel very conflicted having these conversations with people, and to me it's very important to have a conversation and it's either like I've learned something from you or you've confirmed what I've believed. And so I have a very different view than most people, and so I'm curious if in Israel, of course, this is the bias, like they've all followed and drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak, or if there is an openness to what is really happening, an acknowledgement and a movement, so to speak. So I'm curious what you see as happening in Israel as they look at the Palestinian people and their suffering.
Well, that's a very easy question to answer. Israelis vote in very large numbers. These monsters who are in power in Israel were voted in by the people in very large numbers. When this monstrous, bloodthirsty government of Netanyahu was dropping hundreds of tons of bombs on innocent civilians in Gaza, their ratings went through the roof. No Israeli government had ever had such high popularity as Netanyahu's government at the height of the massacre in Gaza this last summer. They had the full support. Netanyahu had the full support of the cabinet, of the Knesset, of the press, and of the people in the street. Everywhere you went and anywhere you went, you heard full support. The only criticism you heard from time to time was that they're not killing enough. That they're not killing them enough. That bringing in 40,000 troops and God knows how many thousands of flyovers with drones and F-16s and whatnot, murdering innocent civilians was not enough. That was the only criticism, but it was very small. The vast majority of the people were completely supportive of this cold-blooded murder. And this was, I remind you again, I'll say this again, this was not like Americans talking about Iraq, someplace most Americans can't even find on a map. We're talking about 10-minute drive from Israeli cities. We're talking about 30-minute drive from Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. We're talking about a country that has full access to all the information. Israel has several TV stations. Every news station suddenly became a 24-hour news station. Every death was mentioned. Every school that was destroyed, every mosque that was destroyed, every family that was murdered by the Israeli army, it was all documented, it was all reported, and it got the full support of the Israeli population. That's what Israelis think.
Can I just say, I have, living here on social media, I see friends who blindly support Israel because they think that they're Jewish, they support the Zionist movement, that they don't know.
In here.
And they'd be posting the alerts of Israel saying, rocket fire, rocket fire, rocket fire. Literally, iPhone, social media, there's an app for them to get alerts for whenever there's a rocket coming, even though we all know that Iron Dome should negate any attack that they have on the population. And the warning for Palestinians is a rocket on the roof, and in 30 seconds you either leave or you die, but you probably have already died from the rocket being shot at you as your quote-unquote warning. So it's very difficult as, engaging with somebody like that in social media.
Okay, first of all, Israel does not use rockets. Israel uses one-ton bombs. Mm-hmm. Okay, some rocket falls, it has to fall on your head to kill you, number one, or hurt you. Number two, if it falls next to you, it makes a little hole on the ground. I've seen it.
But it's just funny to argue with someone.
When a one-ton bomb falls, a one-ton bomb will destroy a city block. Now, multiply that by millions, day after day after day after day. If you haven't read Eyes on Gaza by Dr. Mats Gilbert, who was a Norwegian doctor who worked in Gaza, read his book, listen to his lectures on YouTube. He describes in his lecture the noise. So when he gives his lecture, he's got a PowerPoint, and then he turns on the sound. So you hear what it's like in the ER in Gaza. The mother's crying, the children screaming from pain. He shows very vivid images as well. You hear the drones humming, and you hear the bombs falling, all at the same time. As a surgeon, you have to try and work things out because there's no electricity, using your phone as light. Okay? And again, this is happening 10 minutes away from medical facilities, perfectly modern medical facilities in Israel, 10 minutes away from Gaza. Okay? So there is no comparison. There is no comparison. There is no way to compare, or even say in the same sentence, mention the same sentence, either actually what took place or morally the justifying of a resistance movement that would never have been in place had there not been this brutal occupation and ethnic cleansing and brutal attacks on the civilians in Gaza? Or the volume? Israel called 40,000 reservists. The reservists, that's besides the regular forces that were already there. God knows how many tanks were entered into Gaza. And again, the air assault. There is no comparison whatsoever. And people complain about Hamas as though, Hamas is the devil. This is, of course, what justifies it all, because Hamas, the devil, is in Gaza. Number one, Hamas is a resistance organization. No resistance organization... No resistance organization is created out of air. And we know, it's well documented, when Hamas was established and why it was established. It was established as a resistance organization when the Islamic movement could no longer sit quietly and not react and not respond to the brutality of the Israeli occupation. Now, the option for people in Gaza is not, well, lay down your arms and everything will be peace and quiet. It's you're going to get bombed and killed and you're going to die in your beds, or you're going to get bombed and killed while at least you are resisting. Those are the two options. It's not resist and be killed or sit still and die. So this conversation is absolutely absurd.
I was in Israel this past year and a half, and I went on purpose so that I could have a chance to travel to the territories as often as I could and as freely as I could. I studied counterterrorism at IDC in Herzliya on purpose, for strategic purposes, to understand why people think the way they do and they don't seem to understand what is happening. And with that, I grew up in a Sephardi family, a Turkish family, and there's this whole element in Israeli society that, well, you haven't addressed, Miko, and I would love if you addressed it. The people that come, the Jews that come from the Middle East, and they have bought into all of this, and the government feeds even more hate amongst the population. And when I was there in Rabin Square this past summer, and I hear the sirens from the Iron Dome coming and getting the iPhone app alert, and all I wanted to do was curl up in a ball in my apartment in Tel Aviv, was because I knew that the retaliation was going to be so much, not forget worse, innocent people were going to die. I would go to Rabin Square and then hear Mizrahim, people, Jews from the Arab countries, saying, we hope that you go to Gaza and die too. We hope that you join in. So when you speak of replacing this Zionist regime with a real democratic one, and I'm with you, I understand. Personally, my grandmother was an Auschwitz survivor, and my grandfather became a Zionist as a result. But for me, I don't care if there's no Israel tomorrow. I don't care if there's no state. If there's one state and you call it Palestine, I would go be a citizen and be proud of it. But how do you convince Israeli society of that? How do you bring that? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, even the biggest peace activists in Israel, the ones that say, we're not racist, we want peace, we want this, we want that. The demographics issue, it just seems like a no-go.
You don't convince Israelis of this. It's just like, to end Jim Crow, nobody tried to convince the whites in the South that ending Jim Crow was right, because had they tried to do that, they would still be Jim Crow. Nobody tried to convince whites in South Africa to end apartheid, because again, if they were waiting for whites in South Africa to agree to end apartheid, Nelson Mandela would have died on Robben Island and not as the former president of South Africa. In situations like, that's why there's BDS. That's why there's solidarity groups. That's why there's this. Because the only way to do this is through resistance. The only way to do this is through isolating Israel and boycotts and divestments and sanctions and events like this and protesting and shut down AIPAC and so on and so forth. That's how it's done. There's no convincing a people to give up their privilege just because they should. People are forced to do it. The day after, however, they get up in the morning and they see the sky hasn't fallen. So their kids are going to go to school with Palestinian kids. They may well have a Palestinian prime minister. Can't be any worse than what they've had so far, certainly. And the sky is not going to fall. That's how these things happen. They never happen as a result of a vote or a consensus. They happen as a result of putting such pressure on the state that they have no choice. De Klerk didn't stand up one day and announce that Mandela and all the other prisoners will be freed unconditionally, because they're willing to free Mandela conditionally much earlier, and Mandela said, "Thank you very much, I'm going back to my cell." De Klerk stood up and said the prisoners will be freed unconditionally, and the banned political parties will be unbanned as a result of pressure, because he had no choice. That's how these things operate. And all these Israelis will get up in the morning, they're not going to like it perhaps, they'll get used to it and they'll be fine. And if they really don't like living in a state with Palestinians, they can move somewhere else.
Yeah, we know where.
You know, they can go back somewhere else. That's the reality.
LA.
I have a question, please. I've been waiting for quite a while. Thank you. It's not going to be a lecture or a soliloquy. My question, Mr. Peled, you're a very courageous man, is I'm confused. There's an elephant in the room. And I've been struggling with this, and it's a politically incorrect question, but I'm going to ask it. How do you self-identify as being Jewish? My grandfather was raised and born amongst Palestinian Jews. To me, Judaism is a religion. How do you self-identify as Jewish?
How or why?
How? Are you Jewish? And if so, how do you identify as being Jewish? Is it a religion to you, or is it an ethnicity? I don't believe it's an ethnicity.
I don't either. I think I'm probably the least Semite person here. But that's besides the point. I am what...
It is besides the point. I think it's what causes all the issues. It's Zionism. Zionism says it's an ethnicity.
Okay, and we are here to reject Zionism. At least I am. And that's part of that, you know. That's exactly the point. What Zionism did, I agree with you. I don't disagree with you. What Zionism did very, very successfully and very intelligently, I should say, though it's evil, is create this myth of a Jewish nation. You know, Jews were either Yemenites or Moroccans or Polish or Russian or whatever the case may be, and they all happen to be Jews. And that's, I think, how it is. I think, and the fact still remains, most Jewish people see themselves as that, 'cause otherwise they would have been in Israel. They're not. Most Jews don't live there. Now, if you're asking me personally, you know, I happen to fall into this category of an Israeli Jew. This is my identity. This is where I was born. That's the language I speak. That's who I happen to be. I reject Zionism completely, every aspect of it. I reject this notion that somehow Jews are a nation and they have a right, all that nonsense completely. I'm not a practicing Jew by any stretch of the imagination. You know, just like some people are born Christian or Muslim and they practice and some don't. I don't. I'm not a religious person. And so that's how that's me personally. But again, I agree with you. Zionism created all of this mythology, and then brought in the Bible and it created this impression that the New Testament, I mean the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible is somehow not a book of faith but a history book, and we are the people and this is our history book and that's our country, and they created this whole very, very perfect romantic story, none of which is of course true or historically proven. So I'm with you on that. I don't disagree with you.
But most American Jews will tell you I'm a secular Jew.
Okay.
What's that mean? You're American?
It's like being a secular Christian, I suppose. I don't know.
You talk about how do you make progress on these issues, especially in terms of what's happening in the United States. There's a group of lawyers in Indiana who are trying to get together a case against the American government and against American industry that participates in the genocide and knowingly participates in it. What they need is they need Palestinian plaintiffs to sign on to this lawsuit so that the lawsuit can be prosecuted against the industry, the defense industry, the munitions manufacturers, and the politicians who blindly and radically, rabidly support Israel, notwithstanding the facts that our support of this country really is in violation of the Leahy Act and supporting a foreign government that is terrorizing people. That's one way, in my opinion, to achieve this. And to my Palestinian, my Gaza friend back there, I would encourage you to contact these lawyers. But the other thing, especially, sir, from the CIA and from the Council in the National Interest, in my opinion, it's very important for groups like Code Pink and the Council to coordinate these, and local groups like in Indiana, to make sure that these events are well attended and well coordinated, because a car is not going to drive well if the four wheels are not in coordination. It was very difficult last year, please don't take offense, to get an answer from the council when you guys were going to have your annual convention, and if you're going to try to coordinate it with the AIPAC conference. And then this year you're having your conference in June as opposed to right now. I understand the reasoning for that, but if these events with these various groups are better coordinated, it's less of a strain on those of us who have lives and can only make one trip from Indiana out to Washington, D.C. a year. And especially at the local level, for those of you who are from out of town, get your groups to coordinate rather than to compete with each other. We got to stay together.
Well, you had a couple of observations there. Let me start with the first one. What you're talking about is lawfare, where the legal system is used as a weapon of war, in effect, to bring about political change. The Israelis are very good at this. And as I noted in my talk, last week they got a judgment against the Palestinian Authority, which will be $1 billion judgment if it goes all the way through, which will bankrupt the Palestinian Authority. Now, the issue is that it's very easy for groups like the Israelis to sue on terrorism-related issues in a U.S. court. But it's more difficult by far to make the case that the Israeli government, which carries out its terrorism, is doing the same thing. So it's not quite, you can do it this way or you can do it that way, because the U.S. courts basically have essentially cooperated with the Israeli point of view and gone against the Palestinian point of view, and the State Department, among other organizations, has named virtually every Palestinian resistance group or opposition movement as a terrorist group. So it makes it real easy for Israelis to come here and sue, and it makes it real difficult for Palestinians or Rachel Corrie's family to try to get redress in our courts. The courts just don't admit it. So, I mean, that's one problem. Now, the other issue about why don't we get together and do things, our thing last year was in March. It was the week after the AIPAC conference. The reason why we didn't have more groups and everything involved is it becomes chaotic in terms of organizing the event. It was a one-day event. We could only cover so many issues, and we kept it down to 4 groups that were working together for it. And that seemed to be a reasonable level. But absolutely, I think you know, we've been having discussions this year about what to do, and in June we're going to have, my group, CNI, is going to have a commemoration of the USS Liberty, because many of the survivors are dying. And we want to get as many of them together as we possibly can in June. That's why we're doing it in June. June's the anniversary. So,
internet feed of your program last year was really good.
Well, thank you, thank you. Yeah, we addressed, it was the first conference to address the issue of the Israel-American relationship that was actually covered by C-SPAN. So we got a pretty good audience. We got it's something we want to do again and again and again, and we want to involve as many groups as possible. But there is a bureaucratic issue or an administrative issue in trying to bring a lot of different viewpoints together. But by all means, let's be creative. I mean, if anyone out there has good ideas for doing this, let's take the show to Chicago. Let's take it to New York. Let's go to Boston. These are all viable. These are all good ideas. We have people in this room probably from every part of the country. Let's be thinking in terms of doing this. Send me an email. There are lots of us who have a public face. And get to us and start suggesting things. And I think that behooves us all to do this, and behooves us all now that AIPAC is reeling and Netanyahu is an idiot. We can really basically press this issue better than we have been able to do in the past. You want to?
Oh, can I say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, sir. The other thing to please remember is that there are a number of scholars who have worked for a long time in academia. And when they work, as I did, in a religion department and are pro-Palestinian, Many of the donors of large research universities are Jewish, and they complain that we are frightening Jewish students by talking about Palestine. They remove students for peace because they say that when there is a meeting of students for justice in Palestine, thank you, SJP, that it frightens Jewish students just to see the announcement of a meeting. Now, it sounds really funny unless you're the faculty advisor. Then it's not funny.
That's why we have the First Amendment.
Oh, no, we don't have the First Amendment in academia. Actually, we don't. I mean, I'm sorry, I break your heart, but we don't. We have the First Amendment as long as it doesn't upset students. Now, the other thing is that we have faculty members who have been taken out of their positions, as you know. We also have people who have been denied promotion, denied raises. I mean, there are ways of controlling people, even who are tenured, by controlling money, by controlling research budgets, things like that. And they are quite going on in the United States. And it's a way that AIPAC and other private donors are helping to control how the information is disseminated to the next generation of American leaders. Just thought I'd throw that out. Next question.
I have a question for Miko. I want to say that I really appreciate you putting a laser beam on BDS. I really, really, really do. And your thoughts that ultimately it will be the hubris of the Israelis leaders that will undo them. I think this is true. I'm a little surprised about the 10 years. My question is, what about the very special situation with the people in Gaza? They can't wait 10 years. And from what I understand, what you said, you know that very well. And I think everybody in this room, their heart just bleeds with what's going on. It is just such a total outrage, and we just feel so helpless. What can we do besides BDS for the Gazans?
Well, the only thing I could say is this. When I, like I said, I was there the summer, and then I came here, and there had lots of speaking engagements. In a lot of places, a lot of cities around the country, people were very proud because they had protests organized, which was good. Some had 4,000, maybe one or two had a little bit more, some 10,000, mostly kind of in the hundreds. And I asked the exact same question: where's the outrage? Where's the outrage? This is it? 1,000 here, 5,000 there. This is a massacre in prime time. Now we don't know this is happening. It's not like it's not being shown. It's not like it's not being reported. And the massacre is only part of the problem, because the siege has been going on for years. You know, and the only thing I can say is I agree with you. I'm asking the same question: where is the outrage? I don't think it's talked about enough. I don't think it's not mentioned enough. It's not written about enough. It's not protested enough. It has become, I think we've all become, you know, comfortably numb, even among ourselves, where it's not talked about enough. You know, I was able to visit Gaza about a year ago, it was, or so. But I had to go in through a tunnel. Because, of course, as an Israeli, the Israelis won't let me in, and the Egyptians are bastards, and they won't let anybody in either. So that was the reality. So, but this was a time where there still were tunnels. Now there are no tunnels. So even the little bit of food and water and supplies that were coming in are not there. And I don't know what the answer is. United Nations came out with a report, I think it was last summer or the summer before that, because nobody else seems to be paying attention that you're going to have, by 2020, an additional 500,000 people living in Gaza. So that's over 2 million people without water, fresh, fit for drinking, without basic nutrition, without access to the most basic, most healthcare needs. And again, this is not in some remote mountaintop, God knows where there's nothing. It's 10-minute drive from Israeli cities that have everything.
But how can they rebuild without cement?
Well, they can't do anything, exactly. I mean, they can't rebuild. Nothing. That's why people are homeless. That's why Ayman's family is still homeless. These things are not going away. And the only way this is going to work is if more and more people talk about it, more and more protests are done. BDS is brought to light even, and you juxtapose the reality 10 minutes drive from Gaza and in Gaza, for people to see what we're talking about, and stop this demonization of Arabs and Muslims and Hamas and Palestinians and all this, and realize that this is a tragedy of unbelievable proportions. And any tragedy of this proportion is terrible, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in some remote place, God knows where. But when it's a 10-minute drive from places where everything is plentiful, that makes it worse. It always reminds me of that movie, The Boy in the Striped Pajama. That movie about the two kids, one growing up in the Holocaust in a concentration camp, and the other one is the son of the commander who lives right outside the fence. That's exactly the reality there. That is exactly the reality there.
I'd like to follow up on what you said, that I also believe that because of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, I think that we as a community in United States have to prioritize it and somehow maybe make it a focus that really fight for ending siege of Gaza. I don't know if people realize, but in Gaza people live in such poverty, they live on less than people in Rwanda. 50% of people live below the poverty line, and 110,000 people are homeless. It's really terrible there. I don't think that we can just wait and leave them like that. And also, my heart cringed when you said that it's going to take 10 years. I think we cannot allow another attack on Gaza. There won't be Gaza if we allow this to happen. But I have a question that I wanted to ask. I am very concerned about the radicalization of Israeli society in general. It just went far to the right. And it seems that the wheels are in motion almost like a psychopathic society. And that the correction will have to come from the outside, because if left to its own means, it's going to proceed on a self-destructive path, and this may be very hurtful to us and to the world. I'm trying to make an analogy to nationalism such as Nazism was. In 1920s, nobody knew what Hitler will do by 1945, and then with Zionism it's different, but there are analogies. It's violent, it's based on supremacy, it's based on taking other people's land. There are the same principles.
Except it's the opposite, because we do know what the Zionists are capable of, because Israel was established as a result of terrorism and ethnic cleansing. So the Zionists, we know exactly what they're capable of. It's not like you say in the 20s nobody knew what Hitler was capable of. Today we know exactly what Israel is capable of. And I don't know, people talk about this radicalization of Israeli society. I don't know that that's true. Israel was founded only less than 70 years ago after a massive terrorist assault against a civilian population and a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing. And today we see the results of that. Well, everything that's happening today is a direct result of that massive terrorism caused by the Zionists and the ethnic cleansing. Now, the fact that Israelis used to have this kind of a pseudo little liberal peace movement, and today that's fallen apart, people see that as radicalization. I don't think it's radicalization. I think it's just they're becoming a little bit more honest, because even the liberal wings of the Zionist movement, if you will, and even what was called the peace movement, it's all within the Zionist paradigm. In other words, we agree that for our own benefit, and this is a liberal Zionist perspective, we agree because it is to our benefit to allow the Palestinians a small percentage of their country in areas that we determine to be governed by people that we determine under conditions that we determine, and they can have their own little autonomy there. This is really what the two-state solution was established by people like my father. And again, I talk about that group of people a lot in the book because I was raised with that, and my father was one of those first, radical Zionists who started talking like this. But this is, again, within the confines of Zionist ideology, which says this is our land, this is our country, we are doing everything right, but because we are righteous, we are allowing the people from whom we stole this land a small piece of autonomy, again, within areas that we determine.
Miko, my question is,
so that's why it fell apart.
What is the worst we can expect from Israel?
We've seen, I don't think, we've seen, I mean, what have we seen? As soon Israel was established as a result, who knows how many were murdered. Nobody really knows the number of Palestinians that were killed in 1948. And then from 1948 till today, and as the technology improves, the death toll grows, because every attack on Gaza, we see more and more people killed. Never mind, nobody even talks about thousands of Palestinian prisoners. Nobody talks about what happens in places in the West Bank, because that's considered, compared to Gaza, that's considered luxury, it's paradise. Cities and villages that get 10, 12 hours of water per week across the street from Israeli settlements where there's green lawns and swimming pools. Nobody even talks about that because that's not so bad as Gaza. And so I think we've seen the worst, and we're just going to see more of it. It's not radicalization, it's just maybe some kind of an awakening. The Zionist peace movement and the Zionist liberal, so-called liberal Zionist, there was no choice other than for it to fall apart, because you can't have, you either have racism and you support it, or you oppose racism. You either support colonialist, racist regimes, or you oppose them. There's no middle ground. And what they try to do is to be a racist colonialist and feel good about it. And that falls apart, and that's exactly what happened.
Mary?
Quick question. Will Netanyahu be reelected?
Who cares?
Your opinion.
Who cares?
No.
Hey, Mary, over here.
I want to thank who spoke about Gaza.
No, you have to talk into it. Yeah.
I'm not good at these things. Okay. Because I think that I needed to hear that, and I needed to hear what you said about that, Miko. Because I think all of us are saying it's terrible about Gaza, it's so terrible, what can we do, and we can't do anything, and every day we read about the children dying and freezing and the homeless, and we see the pictures, and we say, well, there isn't anything we can do. And it reminds me that this was the situation in around 2006 when Gaza was really not even talked about. Gaza was off the map. The people in Gaza had been abandoned. After Rachel Corrie was killed, they were closed up. Nobody could get in. Few could get out. And people didn't even know. People know about Gaza. They didn't know about Gaza. And there was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. And I was lucky enough to be one of a very, very small group of people, 4 of us, with others talking about what can we do? What can we do? We've been kicked out of Israel. We can't get in. What can we do? And we decided we were going to sail boats to Gaza. And Gaza had been under blockade. No civilian boats had arrived in Gaza when we arrived there in 2008, 41 years. And the Israelis told us, we're not going to let you go. We're going to stop you. And we said, okay, but we're going anyway. We couldn't believe it that we got there. The point I'm trying to make is, everybody said we were crazy. You're never going to sail to Gaza. We didn't even know about boats. We had no idea what we were doing. And we got 2 little boats, and we got to Gaza. And it was the most amazing, amazing thing that could have ever happened. And what we felt so wonderful, because the people in Gaza also couldn't believe we were going to get there. And we did. So we can't get there. We've tried many more times with boats. I don't know what we can do, but we've got to do something. We've got to do something.
Well, there's a gentleman here from Gaza. What do you think? What do you think, Ayman? What do you think?
First of all, thank you, Miko. You have a Palestinian soul. And I mean, I was listening to every word you said, and you are more than right. And you are talking on our behalf, and thank you so much about telling with your accent, actually, because I don't have American accent. That's why it is very hard for me. So, but I have some questions in regard about the focal point, which is a one-state solution. So, for me personally, I believe it is the best way to move forward. So we can accept a one-state solution, but there is something that we have to think about it, like in terms of the acknowledgement of the pains and the anguish of Palestinians in 1948, in which 1,800,000 Palestinians were expelled from their land to the neighboring countries, and we have 532 villages were completely destroyed. So, and you mentioned about TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Even that was it was interstate conflict. It was between black and white from the same region. But we are talking about interstate and intrastate conflict, like people who came from overseas, and you can say from Ukraine there are 5,000 Jewish immigrants came to Israel, and baby tries to bring a lot of Jewish immigrants to Palestine. So, I mean, what's the process before going to a one-state solution? For us as Palestinians, as I believe, it should be an acknowledgement of our pains. And what's about the refugees, 6 million overseas? What are we going to do about them? Like those people who should come to their parents' live. The other question, this is, I think, it was mentioned by my friend here about the Zionist curriculum in Israel. Do you think it's going to be any change?
The Zionist what?
Curriculum.
Ah, the curriculum. Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
Because I believe, like, next day in Jerusalem, we are the chosen and pure people, and we have to kill other people. So, do you think there will be any change? We want a one-state solution, but Israel is very afraid of the demographic bomb. And you are talking about the oppressed and the oppressor people, and the oppressor will be afraid that the others will be the oppressed, will be the oppressor. So we know the psychology of war. So I mean, I am thinking, like, when you told me about, oh, you have to wait 10 years, and I wish we will not wait, because I want my kids to live as everyone. My question about the focal point, if we want to go on a one-state solution, what we're going to do? Because it should be a trauma healing, it should be a storytelling, and with Israeli superiority, they will not talk with inferior like me. So these are procedural justice. There are something that should be done, and it is just not one-state solution. We can do it. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. One state is not the solution. It's already one state. All of Palestine is one state. It's one Zionist racist state right now. So obviously one state is not the issue. It is one state now. It's a horrifying apartheid racist regime that governs the entire country. It's one state. All Israelis, all Palestinians who live there are governed by Israel. So that is not the issue. The issue is establishing a democracy with equal rights. Now, when I talk with people who are activists, anti-apartheid activists from South Africa, and I was in South Africa last year, and it was an incredible experience. First of all, their solidarity with Palestine is so strong. In the late 80s, nobody believed that apartheid would fall. By 1994, Mandela was president. Am I right? 94, he was president. In the late 80s, nobody believed apartheid would fall. Today, people say, yes, apartheid fell, but look at all the problems. Well, of course there's problems. After 400 years, or God knows how many centuries of this very racist, oppressive, colonialist reality, it takes a long time to heal. Thankfully, in Palestine, the history of this regime is limited to only about 7 decades. So I think we stand a better chance. I think the first step, and again, I'm not saying you have to wait 10 years, My hope is that this would happen much sooner. I'm just saying, realistically speaking, I think that's what we're looking at. But I think we should all do everything we can to end it as quickly as possible. Any Palestinian suffering, any Palestinian dying, any Palestinian child living without proper nutrition or access to clean water is a crime. And it has to end as quickly as humanly possible. Sadly, these things take longer than they should. I think the first step has to be clearly bringing down the Zionist regime like apartheid was brought down through all the means that we discussed. And then once you have a regime that allows for a free political process with real one person, one vote, and you have a representative body, a legislature that represents the people, an executive branch, a government that represents the people, now you have to talk about the right of return and apply the right of return. It's not enough to apologizing for what happened is important, but allowing for the refugees to return is really what's important. And creating the right environment and the infrastructure to allow the refugees who want to return, the ones who to be compensated, to be paid restitution, all of this has to take place, but it can only take place once there is a government and a legislature that represents the people for real, truly. And then you deal with all these other issues, I think clearly the right of return, the siege on Gaza, the political prisoners, these are the top three things that have to be resolved and as quickly as possible, because this is a type of suffering that should not be allowed to continue. And then we go from there, basically. But and that's generally the process.
Thank you, Miko. That gives us a great shopping list. Yes, I would like you to make a kind of roundup comment.
All right, roundup comment.
Send us off into the...
But I think I'll base it on what we've just been talking about. My perspective obviously is somewhat different. I recognize the humanitarian aspects that we're talking about, but to me there's a realpolitik aspect too. I think if change is going to come in Israel, like in South Africa, you have to have a situation like in South Africa where Israel basically no longer has international support at such a level that it allows it to survive. That means the United States. That means, I think, in effect, that we have to work hard, but we've been talking about this all this evening, to change the perception among Americans of what's going on in the Middle East. And the only way we're going to be successful. Sorry?
Excuse me?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely. And the only way we're going to do that is not by talking about the suffering of the Gazans. That was in the media, people reacted to it, but by the next morning they were worried about the Kardashians. So the only way to change this in a fundamental way is to convince the American people that Israel is real bad medicine for the United States. And there's certainly enough evidence out there to convince people. We have to get that out there.
Write to your congressman every day. Send them pictures and say, we of American kids starving and saying, we want the money for our people. Just over and over again.
Amen.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you all for coming. If you have questions,
Enjoyed it very much.
Miko is going to be signing books.
I'm going to get you.
Phil is going to try to get home over the icy roads. And blessings to all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll see you tomorrow.
I wouldn't say friend. He has a feisty job.
He is definitely feisty.
We agreed 90% of the time.
Yes.
We've gotten on each other here as a couple. I've never met him. No, we
Phil, don't leave for a minute,
I'm serious.
You want to do any signings here, sir?
I'll do it right here. Can I steal your spot here?
Yes, I'm
All
going
right.
to move away.
Let's just make sure nobody falls.
Yeah,
Thank
let me
you
move.
so much.
Pardon me, I'm just going to move some of these
sorry.
mics out of the way. Yeah, just bear with me.
Might be selfish. I have three. I have three. Selfish. Yes.
still on? Is this still on?
It is.
All right, I'm just going to command everyone's attention for like 2 minutes. So that we've got the DC-5 that were just arrested. As most of you know, if you've been watching Twitter all day, there are 5 people that were arrested for forcing their way into AIPAC. Here we've got Ariel Gold, who wants to say a few words. I don't know where Sierra is, if she's anywhere, if she's able to say a few words. But these people are heroes, and I want to just give her the mic for just a second to talk a little bit about her experiences today getting arrested. So here she is. Thank you so much. You're awesome.
Hi, everybody. I want to thank everybody for their support today. It was actually very difficult to get arrested. I think, quite seriously, I think AIPAC did not want the publicity of their being arrested, and it took us about 2 hours to get them to arrest us because they tried every which way not to. We finally, after trying to move around, managed to get in the doorway with the door propped open where they would have no choice but to arrest us. We chose to be arrested today to show the gravity of the crimes that AIPAC and Netanyahu are committing against the people of Palestine and the people of the world. So, we're glad to be here tonight, and thank you everybody for your support, and thank you everybody for your support for Palestine. Free Palestine!
I'm a retired military JAG officer doing military commissions, and I have some questions for you about Israel and military government there. Any possibility you put your email address down there? And then the second thing, do you know Roger Waters? Pretty active BDS or CXL?
Yes, I do.
I know him a little bit. You do too then, obviously.
Yeah, I met him at the Russell Tribunal a couple of times.
Oh, okay, yeah, I was there last week. Okay, well, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, thanks.
Truthfully, you think some people really, in the beginning, with the program,
Pardon me, sir. Thank you.
Well, most of them didn't go. Most of them came here.
Yeah, but if you
Some,
had
like
the
my
money to get on a boat, right?
Well, that to make have that. Look, my grandparents. You see in the book, my grandparents chose to come to Palestine.
Right.
That's because somebody was